May 6, 1942, Corregidor Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Melvyn H. McCoy of the U.S. Navy Dental Corps stood on the scorched earth of the fortress and watched the rising sun flag snap in the wind above Malinta Tunnel. For 300 days, the battered island, the last bastion of American defense in the Philippines, had endured a relentless, earth-shattering symphony of Japanese bombardment. Now there was only an unnerving, profound silence. The guns were silent. After a heroic but doomed defense, General Jonathan M. Wainwright had finally surrendered his exhausted garrison of 11,000 American and Filipino defenders. McCoy, a quiet professional from Indiana, had spent the final desperate weeks in the dim, fetid light of the underground hospital. There, his world had shrunk to the gruesome tasks of treating catastrophic shrapnel wounds and extracting teeth shattered by the percussive blasts that shook the very rock around them. His war of scalpels and forceps was over. He thought of his wife Eleanor back home, likely praying for a man she imagined was still bravely fighting. He was no longer a fighter, but a possession. The quiet was more terrifying than the bombs had ever been. His war of survival had just begun. Within hours, Japanese soldiers swarmed over the island known as the Rock, like a conquering tide. They were efficient and utterly devoid of sentiment, herding the dazed defenders into makeshift compounds near the skeletal remains of shattered barracks. McCoy found himself standing among skeletal U.S. Marines, men who had withered away after subsisting on half rations for months, their uniforms hanging like shrouds on their bony frames. A thick carpet of black flies covered everything, drawn by the filth and decay. The air was a putrid mix, the acrid smell of cordite from spent munitions, the sour stench of thousands of unwashed bodies, and the uniquely sweet, rotting odor of uncollected corpses bloating under the tropical sun. A Japanese officer, flanked by a nervous translator, barked commands in sharp, broken English. "Surrender all weapons, surrender all valuables, form ranks for inspection." McCoy watched, frozen with a sense of profound helplessness, as a Filipino soldier was beaten unconscious for attempting to hide a simple fountain pen, a last fragile link to a literate, civilized world. The guards used their rifle butts with a chilling mechanical efficiency. There was no rage in their eyes, no shouting beyond the initial command. It wasn't personal, it was something far worse, policy. It was brutality as a routine part of the day, a lesson delivered in blood and broken bones for all to witness and learn. 3 days later, the systematic dehumanization continued. The Japanese loaded 2,000 prisoners onto decrepit, rust-bucket freighters bound for Manila. McCoy was shoved below deck, wedged into a cavernous cargo hold, designed for perhaps 50 men, now crammed with hundreds. As bodies pressed against bodies in the suffocating darkness, the tropical heat transformed the steel-walled space into a convection oven, a suffocation chamber from which there was no escape. The air grew thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. Men began to faint from heat exhaustion and dehydration. In response to the groans from below, the guards above would occasionally open the hatches just long enough to dump buckets of cold seawater onto them, a momentary shock that did little to alleviate the suffering. Some of the men who collapsed never woke up. The torturous voyage lasted an agonizing 18 hours. When the hatches were finally thrown open at Pier 7 in Manila, the sudden blinding daylight stabbed their eyes. The fresh air was a relief so sharp it was painful. As they stumbled out into the light, they discovered that 12 men among them were dead, having suffocated in the press. Without ceremony, guards dragged the bodies onto the dock like sacks of grain and brutally marched the survivors north toward their final destination, Cabanatuan prison camp. Situated 60 miles northeast of Manila, sprawled across the dusty, sun-baked expanse of former Philippine Army training grounds. McCoy first saw it through a shimmering haze of road dust, an immense and terrifying apparition of despair. Triple rows of barbed wire glinted cruelly under the sun. Crude wooden guard towers, like skeletal watchmen, punctuated the perimeter every 100 yards. Beyond them, row upon geometric row of low bamboo barracks stretched towards the horizon, a sprawling layout of human misery. The main gate bore a large wooden sign, freshly painted in English, that dripped with cruel irony. Work is glory. Beyond it, a population of 8,000 American POWs already existed in what would become the largest and one of the deadliest Japanese prison camps in the Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Melvyn H. McCoy, U.S. Navy, joined them on June 2, 1942. The processing was a 6-hour ordeal designed to strip away every vestige of individuality and military identity. Guards forced the prisoners to strip naked in front of one another, confiscating any remaining personal possessions, a hidden ring, a worn photograph, a last keepsake. They were then issued identification numbers. McCoy ceased to be McCoy. He became prisoner 4271. They shaved his head to the scalp with rough shears, photographed him holding a slate with his new number, and then shoved him toward his new home, Barracks 3, Bay 5. The barracks were nothing more than long, raised bamboo platforms covered by thatched nipa roofs. There were no walls, offering no privacy and no protection from the clouds of malaria-carrying mosquitoes that descended in whining hordes at dusk. 200 ghost-like men were packed into a space built for 80. They slept side by side on the bare, unforgiving bamboo slats, shoulder touching shoulder, their labored breaths mingling, sharing each other's diseases in the stale night air. The camp commandant, Captain Tsuneyoshi, addressed the new arrivals through his interpreter, his voice flat and contemptuous. "You are not prisoners of war," he declared. "You are captives of the Imperial Japanese Army. You surrendered with dishonor. Therefore, you have forfeited all rights under international law. We will teach you the true meaning of military discipline. Obedience brings mercy. Resistance brings death." The threat was not idle. That very night, guards made a public example of 2 young Marines caught stealing a handful of rice from the camp kitchen. They were tied to posts at the main camp entrance, their faces illuminated by lanterns. The guards used them for bayonet practice. It was a slow, deliberate process that took a full 30 minutes. Every prisoner in the camp was rousted from their barracks and forced to stand and watch the gruesome spectacle in absolute silence. McCoy quickly learned the camp's rhythm, a life dictated by brutal repetition and systematic starvation. The day began with the dawn tenko, or roll call, at 05:30 hours. Prisoners stood at attention in neat rows while guards meticulously counted heads, a process that could stretch for 2 hours in the sweltering, humid heat. Men, weakened by malnutrition and disease, frequently collapsed. The guards' response was swift and violent. They were either beaten back to their feet or unceremoniously dragged aside to die in the dirt. Breakfast followed, consisting of a single tin cup of lugao, a rice porridge so watered down with dirty water that it was translucent, resembling dishwater. It offered perhaps 100 calories of sustenance. By 0700, work details were assembled. The strongest prisoners, those who could still walk unaided, were marched out of the camp to brutal labor sites, leveling ground for airfield construction, building roads, or repairing bridges, all for the benefit of the Japanese war machine. The weak, the sick, and the dying remained in camp, assigned to what the Japanese sarcastically termed light duty. This meant burying the daily dead in shallow mass graves, burning the overflowing latrine waste, or hauling buckets of water from contaminated wells, knowing that every sip was a gamble with dysentery. McCoy's pre-war dental training became his lifeline, saving him from the back-breaking labor details that killed so many. The Japanese, seeing his utility, assigned him to the crude camp hospital set up in Barracks 1 and 2. It was a hospital in name only. There were no medicines, no surgical instruments, no bandages, no supplies of any kind. American doctors, themselves prisoners, performed amputations with sharpened mess kit knives, and set fractured bones with splints made from scavenged bamboo. They were forced to stand by and watch helplessly as men died agonizingly from diseases that a single shot of penicillin could cure in a week: dysentery, malaria, diphtheria, and beriberi. Assigned a corner of this house of death, McCoy extracted teeth with a pair of rusty pliers he had found in an abandoned tool shed. There was no anesthetic. His patients, hollow-eyed and feverish, would bite down on leather straps or their own balled-up fists to stifle their screams. The sound of their agony became just another part of the camp's background noise. The camp's death rate spiraled out of control during the summer monsoons of 1942. A virulent strain of dysentery swept through the barracks, killing up to 40 men per day. The sick bay overflowed, with dying men lying on the dirt floor. Outside the designated morgue barracks, bodies were stacked like cordwood, awaiting burial. When the prisoners requested wood for coffins to give their comrades a dignified farewell, the Japanese guards refused. The dead were buried in mass graves, wrapped in torn blankets if they were lucky, but more often than not, buried in nothing at all. During this period, McCoy was given a new ghastly task. A Japanese officer, with a penchant for collecting, decreed that all gold fillings must be removed before burial. Kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by a buzzing halo of flies, McCoy used his pliers and a small hammer to crack the teeth of men he had known. He pried the gold from their lifeless mouths. The metallic clink as it dropped into the collection box, a sickening sound in the suffocating heat. The gold went into the officer's private hoard. McCoy kept nothing. By early 1943, the relentless toll of disease, starvation, and casual execution had reduced the camp's population to just 3,000. In 14 months, 5,000 men had perished. A grim hierarchy formed among the survivors, based on one's usefulness to the Japanese. Doctors, mechanics, and electricians, men with valuable skills, received marginally better rations. The rest slowly starved on a diet of approximately 600 calories daily. This consisted of a small portion of rice, occasional vegetable scraps scavenged from the guards' refuse, and perhaps once a week a single spoonful of fish or meat so rancid it was said to glow in the dark. Men lost 80, 90, even 100 pounds. Their skin stretched taut over their skeletons, their eyes sank deep into their skulls. They began to move in a collective slow motion, a starvation shuffle designed to conserve every precious calorie. Some eventually stopped moving altogether. They would find a spot against a barracks wall and simply sit, staring at nothing, waiting for death to take them. The other prisoners had a name for them: the Zom-Zoms, the living dead. McCoy survived by systematically shutting down parts of himself. He forced himself to stop thinking about his wife in Indiana. He walled off every memory of home, of a good meal, of a soft bed. He narrowed his entire existence to the next immediate thing, the next meal, the next day, the next hour. He extracted teeth. He treated abscessed gums with boiled water and silent prayer. He watched friends die and trained himself to feel nothing. Emotional numbness became a form of armor, a critical survival skill. He observed that the men who held onto hope too tightly, who spoke too often of after the war, were the ones who broke the fastest. Hope was a corrosive acid here. It was better to become an automaton, a flesh and bone machine that performed its functions without question or feeling. Wake, stand for Tenko, swallow the lugao, work, sleep, repeat, don't think, don't feel, don't hope, don't resist, simply exist. But in the closing months of 1944, mere existence became increasingly precarious. American forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur landed at Leyte Gulf in October. The liberation of the Philippines had begun. A current of dangerous electricity ran through the camp as new prisoners, transferred from other facilities, brought whispers of the turning tide. American submarines were sinking Japanese convoys. B-24 Liberator bombers were striking Manila, and Filipino guerrillas were ambushing Japanese supply columns with growing boldness. The Japanese were losing the war, and losing armies did desperate things. The camp guards, once arrogant and confident, grew paranoid and unpredictable. Beatings for minor infractions intensified. Executions became frighteningly routine. A prisoner caught with a hidden hand-drawn map was summarily beheaded in the camp square. Another, accused of deliberately sabotaging a work detail's output, was buried alive up to his neck and left for the ants. The commandant issued new strict orders. Any prisoner communicating with Filipinos would be shot. Possession of any contraband, including paper, was a capital offense. All work details would now operate under a heavy armed guard. A new, terrifying rumor began to circulate. A whisper passed from man to man in the dead of night. The Japanese High Command had issued a kill-all order. They planned to execute every POW before American forces could arrive. It was better to destroy the evidence than to allow thousands of witnesses to their war crimes to be liberated. On December 12, 1944, guards stormed McCoy's barracks at 0400, kicking the sleeping platforms. "Pack belongings, prepare for transfer," they screamed. Within 2 hours, 619 prisoners, the healthiest remaining men in Cabanatuan, stood in a nervous formation. McCoy was among them. They were marched south under heavy guard, arriving at Bilibid prison in Manila by nightfall. An old Spanish colonial prison, Bilibid had been converted into a central POW transit facility. The conditions were even worse than Cabanatuan. Dark, stone-walled cells designed for one man now held 20. There was no ventilation. There was no sanitation. Prisoners were forced to defecate in the corners of their own cells. The stench of ammonia and human waste was so strong it burned the throat. Lice and other vermin covered every surface. Within hours, McCoy's emaciated skin erupted in painfully infected bites. They remained prisoners within a prison at Bilibid for 2 nightmarish weeks, crammed into suffocating cells, receiving only minimal food and water to keep them alive. The guards remained silent about their ultimate destination, but the prisoners who had been there longer, veterans of other transfers, whispered 2 chilling words: hell ships. The Japanese were evacuating valuable POW labor to the homeland aboard unmarked cargo freighters. These ships carried no Red Cross markings and flew no flags indicating they were transporting prisoners of war. To the American submarines and aircraft now dominating the Pacific, they were nothing more than legitimate military targets. Hundreds of Allied POWs had already died violent deaths by friendly fire, drowned in the holds of sunken hell ships throughout 1944. On December 26, 1944, the day after Christmas, the guards marched them to Manila's port district. There, tied to the familiar Pier 7, McCoy saw it, a rusting, decrepit freighter named the Oryoku Maru. It was perhaps 460 feet long, riding low in the water, its hull streaked with rust. The upper decks and cabins were crowded with Japanese military personnel and civilians being evacuated. The POWs, they soon learned, would travel in the cargo holds. Guards with fixed bayonets forced them down narrow, steep ladders into absolute, suffocating darkness. The forward hold swallowed 800 men. McCoy descended into a pit of hell. The moment his feet hit the steel floor, the press of bodies sealed him in. He couldn't raise his arms. He couldn't shift his feet. The temperature, already searing, climbed steadily past 110 degrees. There was no ventilation, no water, and no latrines. Men urinated where they stood, the corrosive liquid pooling around their ankles, soon mixing with vomit and feces. The ship departed Manila Harbor at dusk, slipping into the blackness of the South China Sea. Within hours, the hold descended into a bedlam of human misery. Men began screaming from heat exhaustion and dehydration. A wave of madness swept through the darkness as some, their minds broken, attacked those around them in a desperate fight for a few inches of space or a gasp of less foul air. In response to the growing chaos, the guards above slammed the heavy steel hatches shut, plunging them into total tomb-like blackness. McCoy found a place wedged against a cold steel bulkhead, trying to make himself small, rationing each precious breath. The air grew thick and toxic, a cocktail of human waste and the unmistakable metallic tang of death. Men died standing up, held upright by the sheer press of bodies around them. Others went insane, shrieking and clawing at the darkness until their voices gave out. McCoy retreated into the familiar cold numbness that had kept him alive for 2.5 years. He had survived Corregidor. He had survived Cabanatuan. He would survive this. He had to. The Oryoku Maru sailed northwest along the Luzon coast, bound for the slave labor mines of Japan. Inside the claustrophobic hold, time and reality dissolved. Men hallucinated wildly. Some clawed at their throats, believing they were drowning. Others saw vivid, tormenting visions of food, water, and home. McCoy felt his own consciousness slipping, the edges of his sanity beginning to fray. Then, at approximately 09:30 hours on the morning of December 27th, the world exploded. The sound was a physical blow, a deafening roar that vibrated through the steel hull. American aircraft from the USS Hornet had found them. Chapter 2. The first night in the hold, McCoy lost count of how many times he heard a man scream and then fall silent. The Oryoku Maru's cargo spaces were never meant for human beings. 1,700 men were crammed into claustrophobic compartments originally designed for rice and machinery. The riveted steel walls radiated a relentless, oppressive heat like furnace plates, scorching to the touch. Movement was impossible, so men urinated where they stood. The foul waste pooled on the deck plates beneath them, mixing with vomit and the bloody excrement of those succumbing to dysentery. Within a few hours, the air became so toxic that every breath felt like swallowing poison, a thick cocktail of ammonia, sweat, and death. McCoy pressed his face against the sweat-soaked shoulder of the man in front of him, desperately trying to find a pocket of oxygen in the microscopic gaps between packed bodies. The Japanese had battened down the hatches, sealing them in darkness, leaving only narrow ventilation slats near the high ceiling. Through these small slits came the only light and air, both tragically insufficient to sustain life for so many. On the morning of December 14th, the main hatch creaked open, and guards bellowed orders for the prisoners to send up their dead. From the forward hold alone, McCoy counted 23 bodies hauled up with ropes. The corpses were already stiff, twisted into the agonized shapes their final moments had demanded. Guards dumped them overboard without ceremony, the splashes barely audible over the groaning of the ship. Then came the day's water ration, a single canteen cup to be shared among 20 men. The guards lowered one bucket on a rope into the churning mass of prisoners. Men near the ladder fought like animals to reach it, their humanity stripped away by thirst. Others, trapped deeper in the hold, began to lose their minds entirely. A Navy ensign McCoy had known at the Cabanatuan prison camp started shrieking about imaginary submarines closing in. Another man, sobbing, tried to drink his own urine. McCoy wedged himself against a cold steel support beam and forced himself to think. He shut out the madness, pushing his mind into the familiar grooves of systematic analysis. The ship was moving. He could feel the steady vibrations of the engine through the hull. They were heading north, tracing the Philippine coast. The Japanese were evacuating their most valuable prisoners, senior officers, submarine commanders, men who knew too much about Allied operations. That meant they intended to keep them alive, at least long enough to reach the shores of Japan. But this ship, he knew, would never survive the voyage if American planes found it first. By the third day, McCoy had learned to filter out the cacophony and identify the sounds that mattered. The ship's engine rhythm told him when they were at cruising speed, and when they slowed to navigate treacherous coastal waters. He timed the guard rotations every 4 hours like clockwork. The hatch opened twice daily, once for the dead and once for the water bucket. Between these grim events, time dissolved into a monotonous, sweltering blur. Men whispered to the corpses of friends they'd been unable to move. Others sang hymns until their voices gave out, the frail melodies swallowed by the hold's oppressive silence. A Marine lieutenant colonel named Beecher organized whispered prayers at what he estimated was dawn and dusk. McCoy participated, not from faith, but from a desperate need for discipline. The routine provided a fragile structure, something to mark the passing of the suffocating hours. On the fourth morning, the prayers were shattered by a sound that made every man in the hold freeze. Aircraft engines, unmistakably American aircraft engines. McCoy had heard enough PBY Catalinas and Navy fighters over the past 3 years to recognize the distinct, menacing pitch of Grumman F-6F Hellcats. The engines grew louder, a savage crescendo that culminated in the unmistakable shriek of a diving attack. The first bomb hit the water 50 yards off the port bow. The explosion lifted the entire ship and slammed it back down with bone-jarring force. Men screamed. The hull groaned in protest. McCoy felt the percussive impact travel through his spine. He pressed both hands flat against the bulkhead, bracing for the next hit. It came seconds later, much closer. Then a terrifying new sound. Machine gun fire raked the deck directly above, the heavy slugs hammering against the steel. The Hellcats were strafing. McCoy heard Japanese sailors shouting in panic. Running footsteps pounded overhead. Another bomb struck, this one aft, and the ship shuddered violently. Acrid smoke began to filter down through the ventilation slats, stinging their eyes and throats. In the hold, primordial panic erupted. Men clawed at the locked hatch ladders, their fingernails scraping uselessly against the metal. The strongest pushed the weakest aside in a blind stampede for an escape that didn't exist. Bodies fell, trampled underfoot. Someone grabbed McCoy's shirt and he shoved back instinctively to keep his footing. A fourth bomb exploded so close, the steel hull rang like a gigantic cracked bell. Water began trickling, then spraying, through loosened rivets near the deck line. The ship was taking on water. She was mortally wounded. The American planes circled for another pass. McCoy could hear them clearly now. 3, maybe 4 aircraft, working in lethal coordination. They had no idea they were bombing their own men. The attack lasted 18 minutes that felt like an eternity. When the aircraft finally withdrew, the Oryoku Maru was dead in the water. The engine had fallen silent. Thick, choking smoke filled the holds. Men coughed until they vomited, the air burning their lungs. McCoy tasted blood in his throat. Above deck, Japanese voices screamed orders amidst the chaos. The guards were arguing, their voices sharp with fear. Through the smoke and confusion, McCoy heard a single word repeated several times. Beach. The ship was sinking. The Japanese were abandoning it. Suddenly, the hatch flew open and guards appeared, silhouetted against the grey sky. They brandished rifles, gesturing frantically for the prisoners to climb out. Men surged toward the lone ladder, a frantic, desperate crush. McCoy waited, his mind calculating. Rushing now would get him shot or trampled. He counted to 30, letting the most frantic men fight their way up, then moved with deliberate, controlled purpose. When he reached the ladder, he climbed without looking up, focusing only on the rung in front of him. On deck, the scene confirmed his darkest suspicions. The ship listed heavily to port. 3 gaping holes had been torn in the superstructure. Dead and dying Japanese sailors lay scattered across the deck. To his astonishment, the surviving guards had already commandeered the lifeboats and were rowing furiously toward shore, Subic Bay. McCoy instantly recognized the coastline. The town of Olongapo was visible, 1.5 miles distant. The guards were abandoning the prisoners on the sinking ship. Around McCoy, men began jumping into the water. Some, in their desperation, tried to swim for shore immediately. It was a fatal mistake. Japanese machine gunners positioned on the beach opened fire, methodically cutting them down. The water around them turned red. Other prisoners, more cautious, clung to floating debris. McCoy assessed his options with the cold clarity of a submarine officer calculating depth charges. Swimming directly to shore meant certain death from the beach guns. Staying on the ship meant drowning when it inevitably went under. The only viable option was to survive in the water long enough to reach the shore after dark, when the guards couldn't see their targets. He estimated he needed to survive for 6 hours. A large wooden hatch cover drifted past. McCoy grabbed it, hauling himself partially onto it. Around him, hundreds of other prisoners were doing the same, clinging to wreckage, barrels, anything that would float. The guards continued firing sporadically from the beach, but most prisoners had learned to stay low in the water, making themselves difficult targets. McCoy watched a Navy commander named Ports, a man he knew by reputation, organize a group of 20 men around a large piece of decking. They were lashing themselves together with ropes salvaged from the ship. Ports had been a damage control officer. He understood buoyancy and the cold physics of survival. McCoy slowly paddled his hatch cover closer to Ports's group. "Commander, room for one more?" Ports looked him over, his eyes sharp and assessing. He recognized McCoy from the submarine service. He gave a single curt nod. McCoy tied himself to the makeshift raft with a piece of salvaged line. 6 other officers shared the precarious platform. 2 other submariners, 3 Army Air Corps pilots, and a Marine artillery captain named Bolans. None of them spoke at first, conserving what little energy they had. They were too focused on the simple, overwhelming task of breathing and keeping their heads above water. The relentless sun burned overhead, turning the surface of the bay into a shimmering, indifferent mirror. Dehydration quickly became the most immediate threat. One of the pilots, a young lieutenant named Schindler, started to hallucinate after 3 hours, crying out about a rescue boat that wasn't there. Bolans, the Marine, held him down when he tried to swim for it. "Save your strength," the captain said, his voice a quiet rasp. "Dark's coming." McCoy tilted his head back, his salt-crusted eyes scanning the sky. It was clear, no more friendly aircraft, and no Japanese ships were coming to retrieve their prisoners. They had written off the Oryoku Maru and everyone on it. As the sun descended towards the Zambales Mountains, McCoy counted the bodies floating in the water. At least 200 dead, probably more. Sharks had appeared within an hour of the bombing. He had seen 3 men taken, their screams cut mercifully short. The trick, he observed, was to remain as still as possible, not to thrash. Panicked, wounded men attracted the predators immediately. McCoy kept his breathing slow and controlled, a lifetime of submarine discipline now being applied to a different kind of pressure hull. Around 1800 hours, Ports gave the order. "Start swimming, slow and steady, stay together." The small group began kicking weakly toward shore. The distance was less than a mile now, but in their starved and weakened state, it felt infinite. McCoy's legs cramped after 20 minutes. He pushed through the pain, focusing on a simple rhythm. Kick, breathe, kick, breathe. The Marine next to him started to founder, his movements becoming sluggish. McCoy reached out, grabbed his collar, and kept him moving. They swam into the gathering darkness, navigating by the distant mocking lights of Olongapo. When McCoy's feet finally touched the muddy bottom, his legs nearly collapsed. He crawled onto the beach on his hands and knees, salt water and bile retching from his stomach. Almost immediately, Japanese guards surrounded the exhausted survivors. Bayonets were fixed. Orders were shouted in harsh, guttural Japanese. McCoy raised his hands and stood slowly, his body trembling. Around him, perhaps 300 other prisoners staggered out of the surf. The rest, more than 1,300 men, were dead or still floating in the bay. The guards herded the survivors onto a nearby tennis court. There was no shelter, no water, just bare, packed ground surrounded by a high barbed wire fence. McCoy collapsed onto the dirt, his body shaking uncontrollably with hypothermia from the long hours in the water, despite the warm night air. Schindler lay next to him, unconscious. Boland sat bolt upright, his eyes staring at nothing. Ports did a head count of their small group. All 7 had made it. Lucky, Ports said quietly, his voice hollow. McCoy didn't respond. Luck had nothing to do with it. Calculation, discipline, and ruthless triage had kept them alive. The men who panicked had died. The men who tried to be heroes had died. The men who waited and planned, they had survived. The next morning, several Japanese officers appeared at the tennis court. They counted the prisoners, their faces grim, and consulted papers on a clipboard. Then, through an interpreter, they announced the plan. There would be a new ship. The prisoners were to be marched to the town of San Fernando, then transported by rail to another port. Another unmarked vessel, another hell ship. McCoy listened without expression, but his mind was already working again, observing, analyzing, calculating. During the desperate swim to shore, he had noticed something critical, a detail he now understood was a profound weakness. The Japanese guards couldn't swim. When the Oryoku Maru went down, not a single guard had entered the water to control the prisoners. He saw it in the way they clung to the lifeboats, their frantic haste to reach the beach, never once getting wet, to corral the men. They had stayed at a distance and relied solely on rifle fire to maintain control. That was a weakness, a significant, exploitable weakness. If McCoy ended up on another ship, and it was now clear he would, and if that ship also came under attack, the guards would face the exact same limitation. They couldn't follow prisoners into the ocean. McCoy filed this information away, the way he had once filed tactical data about enemy shipping lanes and patrol patterns. 2 days later, the Japanese marched the survivors north. 115 more men died on the road to San Fernando. They were given no food, minimal water, and the guards shot or bayoneted anyone who stumbled or couldn't keep pace. McCoy watched a Navy lieutenant he'd known since training school get bayoneted for pleading for water. His body was left in a ditch by the side of the road. At San Fernando, they were brutally crammed into steel boxcars, packed in again, standing room only, for a sweltering 12-hour journey to the port of San Fernando in Lingayen Gulf. McCoy wedged himself into a corner of the boxcar and studied the faces of the other prisoners. He identified the ones who would likely survive another ship, Ports, Bolands, and a handful of others who moved with deliberate efficiency despite their starvation and dysentery. These were the men to stay near, the men who planned instead of hoped. On December 27, 1944, the broken survivors were loaded onto another unmarked freighter, the Oryoku Maru. As McCoy climbed into the dark hold, he found a position near a main support beam, close to a ventilation shaft. He was learning the architecture of hell ships, where to position yourself for maximum air, how to identify the men who would share water instead of hoarding it. He was gathering intelligence the way he'd once gathered it about enemy submarine hunters, because Lieutenant Commander Melvyn H. McCoy had made a cold, hard decision somewhere between the deck of the Oryoku Maru and the beach at Subic Bay. He was going to survive this, and when the opportunity came, when the next attack happened, and he knew with absolute certainty it would, he would be ready to do something that no prisoner of war had successfully done before. He would escape from a hell ship in the middle of the ocean. The pieces were already forming in his mind. The guards' inability to swim, the inevitable chaos of an air attack, the possibility of reaching land if you knew the currents and could navigate by the stars. McCoy had commanded submarines in these very waters. He knew the coastlines, the tides, the distances between islands. What he needed now was the perfect moment, the right combination of attack, location, and chaos, and he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he had to stay alive long enough for that moment to arrive. Chapter 3, December 15, 1944, Subic Bay, Philippines. A roar of engines ripped the air above the Oryoku Maru. For Lieutenant Commander Melvyn H. McCoy and the men in the hold, the sound was horribly familiar. American planes. Bombs exploded, shaking the ship violently before a direct hit tore through the deck, sending fire and shrapnel into the packed hold. Men screamed, burned, and died instantly. The ship was sinking. Amid the chaos, Japanese guards opened the hatches and ordered survivors overboard, pointing toward a small island with a tennis court, their next prison. Watching men drown in burning oil as his own side's planes circled to attack, McCoy made a split-second decision. He would not swim to another prison. He would swim for his life. His only chance, the distant, jungle-covered shore. The water hit McCoy's body like a physical blow, cold despite the tropical heat. The bay churned with burning oil, debris, and desperate men. Some swam toward the island, resigned to their next captivity. Others floated, too weak or broken to care. McCoy's arms pulled through the water, angling away from the island and the sinking ship toward the dark line of jungle 2 miles distant. Each stroke took him farther from the other prisoners, farther from what the Japanese expected, into a decision that would likely kill him. But death swimming for freedom felt entirely different than death waiting for the next bomb or another transport to hell. His lungs burned, his emaciated muscles screamed. He kept swimming. The mental shift happened in the water. For nearly 3 years, McCoy had merely endured. The Bataan death march, the mass death of Camp O'Donnell, the methodical starvation of Cabanatuan, and the suffocation-packed hellship journey in the Oryoku Maru's hold. He had survived by becoming passive, shutting down the parts of his mind that screamed for action. But the American bombs changed everything. His own navy had just killed dozens of his men. They couldn't have known, but McCoy understood with sudden clarity that waiting for liberation meant waiting to die, whether by Japanese execution, friendly fire, or another hell ship bound for Japan, where they'd work until they dropped. The passive survival strategy had run its course. Action, even suicidal action, was the only rational choice left. The shore seemed impossibly far. His pre-war Naval Academy swim training was for a different body, a different man. He weighed perhaps 120 pounds, down from 170. Malaria and dysentery had hollowed him out. But 3 years of careful observation, staying alert while others despaired, had taught him something valuable. The Japanese were not omniscient. They made mistakes, got lazy, and assumed compliance. In the chaos of the sinking ship and continued air attacks, the guards were focused on herding prisoners to the island. They expected every man to swim where directed. McCoy was betting his life that one man swimming the wrong way might go unnoticed long enough to matter. He forced himself into a steady pace, the methodical stroke of a man with a destination. The sounds of chaos continued, shouting, orders, aircraft engines, explosions, but McCoy focused on breathing, rhythm, and the shoreline. His mind began working in a way it hadn't for years, calculating and assessing. The jungle offered cover, but also danger. He had no weapons, food, or tools. His body was a wreck. He didn't know which direction led to Filipino guerrillas versus Japanese strongholds. Every variable pointed toward failure, yet he also remembered pre-war intelligence briefings and maps. The Philippines had an active resistance. Filipinos had risked everything to help prisoners before. Reaching them depended on surviving the jungle, avoiding patrols, and his body not giving out. McCoy kept swimming. The water around him cleared of oil and debris as he pulled away from the wreck. His arms felt like lead, each breath harder, but something unexpected flooded him: clarity. For the first time since surrendering at Corregidor in May 1942, McCoy felt like himself again, not a prisoner or a victim, but an American officer executing a tactical decision. The odds were terrible, but better than staying in Japanese custody. He'd watched too many good men die, waiting for a rescue that never came. Beecher, Williams, Jacobson, hundreds more. They'd played by the rules, maintaining discipline and dignity until starvation or disease killed them. McCoy refused to join that list by passive acceptance. If he died today, it would be while fighting for his life, not waiting for death. The shore resolved into detail: mangrove roots, dense vegetation, rocky outcroppings. No visible Japanese positions, but that meant nothing. McCoy's feet touched bottom and he nearly collapsed, his legs unused to supporting weight. Staggering forward into the shallows, he dropped flat behind a fallen log. Gasping, listening, insect sounds, bird calls, distant explosions from the attack on the Oryoku Maru. No voices, no movement. He'd made it to shore. Now the real test began. His body demanded rest, but McCoy forced himself to move, crawling deeper into the jungle, putting distance between himself and the waterline. Every few feet he paused, listening. Training from another lifetime reasserted itself. Avoid silhouetting, move during noise cover. His senses, dulled by imprisonment, sharpened with desperate necessity. The jungle smelled of rot and growth, overwhelmingly alive after the death stench of the prison ship. He was filthy and emaciated, but for the first time in years, McCoy felt the possibility of agency. He could fight back, even if it only meant surviving long enough to deliver intelligence about Japanese atrocities to advancing American forces. After 50 yards, McCoy found a dense thicket and burrowed into it, finally stopping. His body shook with exhaustion and adrenaline. He needed water, food, and rest, but first he had to think. The Japanese might send patrols for prisoners who hadn't reached the island, or they might not bother. He had hours, maybe a day, before any organized search. In that time, he needed to find water, move farther inland, and locate signs of Filipino civilians who might lead him to guerrillas. It seemed impossible given his physical state. His muscles were wasted, feet bleeding from coral, his skin feverish. Objectively, the escape was insane, but sanity was relative. Staying on the Hell ship had been insane. At least this insanity was his own. He allowed himself 10 minutes, then forced his body upright. The jungle canopy filtered the sun into green twilight. McCoy oriented himself by memory and instinct, recalling maps he'd seen years ago. Japanese concentrations were along the coast and main roads. Filipino villages were inland, in the mountains. He needed to move east and north, higher into guerrilla territory. Every step was agony. His legs trembled, his vision blurred. But McCoy walked. The transformation continued with each step. He wasn't thinking like a prisoner, focused only on enduring the next hour, but like an intelligence officer on a mission. He observed everything: plants that might indicate water, animal trails, the angle of the sun. His memory pulled fragments of survival training from the Naval Academy and pre-war exercises. He recalled that bamboo could provide water and certain palm hearts were edible. His mind raced with tactics, moving at night to reduce discovery, avoiding cleared areas, listening for Japanese voices before entering new terrain. By late afternoon, McCoy found a small stream. He collapsed beside it, drinking slowly despite his body's demand to gulp. Too much too fast would make him sick. He forced discipline. Small sips, a pause, more small sips. The water tasted of earth and life. He soaked his ruined feet and washed the salt from his skin, feeling marginally more human. His stomach cramped but held the water down. It was a small victory. He'd survived the swim, found water, and covered 2 miles of jungle, feats that had seemed impossible hours ago. Permitting himself a moment of grim satisfaction, he forced himself back to his feet. He needed more distance before dark. As twilight deepened, McCoy found a massive fallen tree and crawled beneath its root system, creating a small shelter. He gathered leaves for insulation, then finally allowed exhaustion to claim him. But even in sleep, his mind worked differently. No more nightmares of the camp. Instead, his subconscious processed problems of survival and evasion. The passive prisoner was gone, replaced by something harder, more desperate. A man who had decided that death attempting the impossible was better than life accepting the inevitable. McCoy had crossed 2 miles of water and jungle, but he'd also crossed the far more important distance between victim and survivor, between prisoner and a free man fighting for his life. The journey back to American lines stretched ahead, impossible and necessary. He slept briefly, dreamlessly, already planning tomorrow's moves. McCoy's arms moved mechanically through the oil-slicked water, each stroke a calculated negotiation between his failing body and his iron will. The sea tasted of fuel and death. Commander Frank Bridget surfaced beside him, gasping, his face grey beneath the grime. Behind them, the Japanese guards on Olongapo Point continued firing into the mass of prisoners swimming toward captivity. Ahead, nothing but open water and the slim possibility of survival. The Hellcats made another pass overhead. McCoy filled his lungs and dove, forcing himself deep into the dark water, despite every instinct screaming for air. The fighter's shadows rippled across the surface above him. His chest burned, deeper. The strafing runs sent bullets slicing through the water in trails of bubbles. One passed close enough that he felt the pressure wave against his shoulder. When he finally surfaced, choking and desperate, Bridget was still there, along with Lieutenant Commander Warner Ports and Commander Wilbur Dodson, 4 men swimming away from certain recapture toward almost certain death in the jungle. The decision to swim for Bataan had formed in seconds during the chaos of the bombing. McCoy had served in these waters before the war. He knew the peninsula, knew its dangers, knew the Japanese controlled every road and village. But he also knew something else. Filipino guerrillas operated in those mountains. If they could reach the jungle, if they could survive the swim, if they could evade Japanese patrols, if they could find the guerrillas before starvation or disease killed them, too many ifs. But the alternative was swimming back to rifle muzzles and another hell ship bound for Japan or Formosa. The mathematics were simple: certain death versus probable death. McCoy chose the probability. Bridget had been the first to understand McCoy's intention when their eyes met in the water. No words exchanged, just recognition between 2 men who'd survived Bataan's fall, the Death March, Camp O'Donnell, Cabanatuan, the Hell Ship voyage. Bridget turned toward Bataan. That single decision was trust distilled to its purest form. Follow this man into almost certain death because the alternative was hopeless. Ports and Dodson followed because they'd watched McCoy survive the unsurvivable for 3 years. At Cabanatuan, McCoy had maintained a discipline that kept men sane. On the Hell Ship from Manila, he'd organized the prisoners in the hold to maximize air circulation, saving dozens from suffocation. When beaten for protesting conditions, he absorbed the punishment without breaking. These men knew if anyone could navigate them to freedom, McCoy could. But that knowledge didn't make the swim less terrifying or the odds less brutal. The current fought them with every meter. McCoy's shoulders screamed, his starved muscles now burning their last reserves of strength. His hands had gone numb. He focused on mechanical efficiency. Stroke, breathe, stroke, breathe. Don't think about the distance. Don't think about sharks drawn by blood in the water. Don't think about cramping in open ocean. Think about the next stroke. Bridget faltered. McCoy saw him slip beneath the surface, pulled under by exhaustion. He reached him in 3 strokes, grabbed his collar and hauled his head above water. Bridget coughed, sucked air, nodded. McCoy released him but stayed close. They couldn't help each other much. Each man barely had strength for himself, but proximity meant something. It meant they didn't die alone. The shore grew closer with agonizing slowness. What looked like a few miles from the burning prison ship revealed itself as a marathon swim for men barely able to walk. The green jungle line separated into individual trees, then details: coconut palms, dense undergrowth, rocky beach. McCoy's feet touched bottom 100 meters from shore. He stood, stumbled, fell back into waist-deep water. His legs wouldn't support him. He crawled. Bridget crawled beside him. Ports and Dodson reached to the shallows minutes later. All 4 men reduced to desperate animals dragging themselves onto the beach. McCoy's hands dug into wet sand, pulling his body forward. Every breath tasted of salt and fuel. His vision tunneled. 20 meters of beach, then 10, then the tree line. He collapsed in the shadow of a coconut palm, chest heaving, muscles twitching with exhaustion. They'd made it to shore. Now the real danger began. Bridget rolled onto his back, eyes closed, breathing in ragged gasps. How far? To Guerrillas? McCoy didn't answer immediately. He didn't know. The guerrilla networks across the Philippines were fragmented, mobile, hunted. Before the war, American officers had trained Filipino scouts in these mountains. Some of those scouts would have gone guerrilla after Bataan fell, but 3 years had passed. The Japanese had executed thousands of civilians for aiding resistance fighters. The guerrilla bands that survived would be cautious, paranoid, quick to kill strangers, potential Japanese agents. "We find high ground," McCoy said finally. "Make contact carefully, show we're American." "And if we find Japanese first?" Ports asked. "We don't." McCoy sat up, despite his body's protests. Sitting still meant death. Japanese patrols would search the coastline after the sinking. They had hours, maybe less. Move inland, now. None of them could stand without help. They hauled each other upright, swaying, 4 skeletal figures in ragged shorts, barefoot, unarmed, deep in enemy territory. McCoy oriented himself by the sun sinking west. East meant deeper into the peninsula, away from the coast and the Japanese naval base at Subic Bay. East meant mountains and jungle where guerrillas might operate. East meant difficulty for Japanese patrols using roads and lowlands. They stumbled into the tree line. The jungle swallowed them immediately. Dense vegetation, vines and undergrowth tore at their legs. No trail, just forcing through greenery. McCoy led, choosing the path of least resistance, climbing gradually toward higher ground. His feet bled. He didn't slow. The sounds of bombing faded behind them, replaced by jungle noise, insects, birds, wind through palms. Every shadow could hide Japanese soldiers. Every snapped twig could be a patrol. McCoy's senses sharpened despite exhaustion. He watched for signs of human passage, broken branches, footprints, worn paths. They had to avoid contact until they knew friend from foe. Darkness fell with tropical swiftness. They'd covered perhaps 2 miles, climbing into foothills. McCoy called a halt in a dense thicket. No fire, no light. They sat in darkness, listening, bodies cooling, as dehydration and hunger overwhelmed the adrenaline that had sustained them. "Water tomorrow," McCoy whispered. "Find a stream, rest, then push deeper." "And food?" Dodson asked. "Forage what we can, coconuts, fruit, nothing that requires fire." They understood. Smoke would draw Japanese patrols like a beacon. Raw food or nothing. Their stomachs, shrunken from years of starvation rations, cramped with emptiness. McCoy's mouth was cotton dry, his tongue swollen, but water required movement, and movement required light. Dawn would come. They would find water, then they would survive another day. Sleep came in fitful stretches. Bodies too exhausted to maintain consciousness, but too terrified for real rest. McCoy woke repeatedly to jungle sounds, hand reaching for weapons he didn't have, mind taking seconds to remember where he was. Free, technically. Hunted, certainly. Alive, barely. Dawn light filtered through the canopy. McCoy rose, every joint screaming protest. The others stirred, groaning. Bridget's lips were cracked and bleeding. Ports could barely open his swollen eyes. Dodson shivered despite the tropical heat, possibly from malaria returning without quinine. They moved uphill, listening for water. McCoy heard it first, flowing water ahead. He followed the sound, cautious, remembering that water sources attracted everyone. Guerrillas, Japanese patrols, civilians. They approached slowly. The stream was clear, tumbling over rocks through a small ravine. McCoy scanned the area, saw no recent human signs, and made the decision. They descended to the water. He knelt, cupped his hands, drank. The water tasted of earth and minerals and life. He drank until his stomach cramped, then drank more. The others followed, all 4 men desperate, vulnerable, completely exposed. Voices carried through the jungle, Filipino voices, close. McCoy froze, hand raised, signaling silence. The others heard it too. The voices grew louder, multiple speakers, moving confidently through the jungle. Guerrillas or Japanese collaborators, no way to know until too late. McCoy made a decision that would either save them or kill them. He stood, stepped into view, and raised both hands above his head. "Americans," he called in English, his voice hoarse. "American prisoners, we need help." The jungle went silent. Then figures materialized from the vegetation. 5 men armed with rifles and bolos, dressed in ragged military uniforms and civilian clothes. They stared at the 4 skeletal Americans, rifles raised, uncertain. An older Filipino stepped forward, rifle steady but not aimed. His eyes moved over McCoy's emaciated frame, the scars, the bearing that even starvation couldn't erase. "You escaped, Japanese. From the prison ship, bombed yesterday in Subic Bay. We swam to shore." The Filipino's expression shifted, calculation replacing suspicion. "Many prisoners died yesterday. We heard bombing." He lowered his rifle slightly. "You officers?" "Lieutenant Commander Melvyn McCoy, United States Navy. These men are also officers." McCoy kept his hands visible. Everything depended on the next seconds. "We're trying to reach American lines or guerrilla forces loyal to the United States." The Filipino studied him for a long moment, then spoke rapid Tagalog to his companions. They lowered their weapons. "I am Sergeant Teodoro Baluyot. We are USAFE guerrillas, Bataan sector. You come with us. Captain Pajota will decide what to do with you." McCoy's legs nearly gave out with relief. USAFE, United States Armed Forces in the Far East, MacArthur's guerrillas. They'd found allies, not executioners. "Thank you, Sergeant." Baluyot gestured toward the jungle. "Long walk to camp, can you make it?" McCoy looked at his companions. Bridget could barely stand. Port shivered with fever. Dodson's bleeding feet left marks on the rocks. All 3 men met his eyes and nodded. They hadn't swum through hell and crawled through jungle to quit now. "We'll make it," McCoy said. They followed the guerrillas into the mountains. 4 American officers returned from death, walking into a jungle still crawling with enemies. Behind them, the coast. Ahead, uncertainty. But ahead also meant possibility, meant resistance, meant the slim chance of survival transforming into the real prospect of return. McCoy put one bleeding foot in front of the other and kept moving, because that's what prisoners who refused to die did. They moved forward until forward became freedom. Chapter 5, December 1944, Mountains of Luzon, Philippines. After scrambling ashore from a sunken prison ship, Lieutenant Commander Melvyn H. McCoy and a handful of other survivors found themselves deep in hostile territory. Starving, barefoot, and clad only in rags, they evaded Japanese patrols for days, their survival hinging on villagers who risked execution to give them food. The hunt was relentless. Constantly on the move through dense mountainous jungle, their bodies were racked with fever and exhaustion. Their only hope came as a whisper. Filipino guerrillas operated in the hills. Making contact was their sole path to survival, a dangerous undertaking that could lead to freedom or a Japanese trap. McCoy's feet leave bloody prints on volcanic rock, each step splitting skin shredded by 3 barefoot days in the jungle. His vision blurs. He steadies himself against a tree, bark rough against palms slick with fever sweat. Behind him, 2 others struggle up the slope. Marine Corporal William Delich, a skeletal frame in a canvas rag, moves like a ghost. Navy Ensign Robert Spielman stumbles but keeps climbing. No one speaks. It wastes energy. The mountain rises steep, roots offer handholds. McCoy pulls himself up, ignoring the fire in his muscles and the emptiness in his gut. Yesterday, a Filipino farmer risked his life to give them 3 balls of rice wrapped in banana leaves. He refused payment, just pressed the food into McCoy's hands, pointed northeast, and whispered one word: guerrillas. How far northeast McCoy doesn't know, nor if the intelligence is a trap, but staying near the coast means capture. The Subic Bay garrison is searching, every village warned, every trail watched. The only direction is up, into mountains where patrols are fewer and survival might be possible. His hand closes on a root and he pulls. His legs shake. Latent malaria is returning, felt in the chills that rack him despite the heat, in thoughts that slow and scatter. The ship bombing feels like months ago, but it was just 4 days. 4 days since American planes tore apart the unmarked POW vessel. 4 days since he swam through oily water, thick with drowning men, crawled ashore, and began to run. A sound stops him, distant but distinct. Dogs. McCoy freezes. Behind him, Delich and Spielman go still. The barking echoes off the mountainside, its direction impossible to pinpoint. McCoy scans the slope above, 50 meters to the ridgeline. The barking continues, not closer yet. He moves again, fear overriding exhaustion. His hands find holds, feet scrambling for purchase on crumbling rock. He slides, catches himself, climbs. 40 meters, 30. His lungs burn. Vision darkens at the edges. 20. The barking stops. Worse than the sound itself, silence means the dogs have the scent. They're tracking now, handlers running behind. McCoy reaches the ridge and collapses, gasping for air. Delich appears beside him, then Spielman. For 30 seconds they lie on bare rock, chests heaving. Then McCoy forces himself up and looks back. The valley spreads below, vast and green. On a thin trail 3 ridges away, tiny figures move. 10, maybe 15 soldiers fanning out in a systematic search. Somewhere down there are the dogs. McCoy turns. The mountain continues upward. More jungle, more ridges, no sign of habitation. His legs nearly give out, but he locks his knees and points upslope. Delich and Spielman nod. They start walking. While McCoy and the survivors climbed toward uncertain salvation, the Japanese garrison commander at Subic Bay, Major Takeshi Nakamura, stood before a map of Luzon's mountains. Red marks indicated sightings, blue for patrol routes, black for villages searched. The escaped prisoners had vanished. Nakamura's jaw clenched. 4 days since the transport sank. 4 days since prisoners who should have drowned made shore. His intelligence officer estimated 15 Americans were loose in contested territory, capable of reaching guerrilla forces who would shelter them, and turns their survival into a propaganda victory. Unacceptable. He'd already reported the escape to division headquarters in Manila, and division demanded results. The prisoners must be found and prevented from reaching guerrilla sanctuaries. Failure meant consequences. Consequences Nakamura preferred not to contemplate. He turned to his assembled officers, 6 lieutenants awaiting orders. The operations room hummed behind them. A clerk entered with a decoded message. Nakamura read it, his expression hardening. Division was sending 50 infantry specialists in mountain warfare, arriving tomorrow. Until then, he had to maximize his 3 deployed patrols. 1 north from the coast, 1 sweeping west, 1 pushing east along escape routes. The coastal patrol had dogs. The hunt depended on infantry, on persistence, and on the certainty that starving men couldn't outrun healthy soldiers. Nakamura issued rapid orders: extend patrol range 10 kilometers north, focus on high ground where the prisoners would avoid the stronger Japanese presence in lowland villages, increase incentives for civilian informants, rice and protection for information, for any Filipino found sheltering escapees, execution for their family as well, and the village burned. The orders were harsh, but Nakamura knew guerrillas controlled much of the interior. He knew the populace hated the occupation and would hide Americans. Terror was the only tool that sometimes worked, sometimes was enough. The lieutenant saluted and departed. Nakamura studied the map again. The mountains were vast, the jungle thick, but the prisoners were weak, sick, and unarmed. They couldn't survive indefinitely. Starvation or disease would stop them if his patrols or informants didn't find them first. One way or another, they would be accounted for. He returned to his desk and began a report for division. Progress steady, recapture imminent. The words felt hollow. The truth was he didn't know where they were or if they were even alive, but admitting uncertainty was impossible, so he wrote with a confidence he didn't feel, projecting a competence he didn't possess, and prayed his patrols delivered results before division lost patience. At dusk, McCoy hears the dogs again, much closer. The 3 survivors crouch in a ravine carved by seasonal runoff, now dry except for stagnant pools green with algae. They have been moving for 6 hours since the ridgeline, an agonizing pace of climbing and descending that gained maybe 5 kilometers. Every step is a negotiation between body and will. The will is winning, but barely. The barking echoes through the darkening jungle, dogs excited, following a scent hours old but still readable. McCoy knows the patrols are gaining. Healthy men move faster than dying men. Delich points upstream to a depression in the bank, an overhang, concealment. They move toward it, feet splashing through shallow water and disturbing swarms of insects. The rock shelf juts out over a hollow carved by ancient floods. Not a cave, but close. It offers space for 3 men pressed tight, sheltered from view from above. They crawl inside. The cool stone draws heat from McCoy's fevered body. Delich and Spielman squeeze in beside him, sitting in darkness as daylight fails. The dogs continue barking, moving parallel to the ravine, maybe 800 meters away. Not closer, not yet. Minutes pass and the barking fades, the patrol sweeping a different sector. McCoy allows himself to breathe. The respite might last an hour or until morning. It might end in minutes. No way to know. He closes his eyes, fighting the sleep that tugs at him. Sleeping means capture, but his body is shutting down. Fever and exhaustion are stronger than fear. He jerks awake. How long was he out? Minutes? Hours? The ravine is black under a moonless, cloudy sky. He listens, hearing insects, trickling water, and Delich's ragged breathing beside him. No dogs, no voices, no patrol. His watch's luminous hands show 10:30, 2 hours unconscious. He shifts position, his legs cramping, muscles knotted from climbing, from running, from days of effort beyond capacity. Spielman's whisper is barely audible. Should they move at night? McCoy considers. Moving in darkness risks slower progress, injury, or walking into a patrol. Staying means being found if patrols sweep this area at first light. Both options are terrible. He chooses movement. Sitting still feels like dying slowly. At least movement is action. They crawl from the overhang into darkness so complete McCoy can't see his hand. They move by touch, following the ravine upward. McCoy leads, testing each step. Progress is measured in meters per minute. Behind, Delich and Spielman follow in a human chain shuffling through the blackness. The ravine narrows to a crack between vertical walls, the water deeper here. McCoy wades forward. The water reaches his knees, shockingly cold against his fever. His teeth chatter. His body's temperature regulation has collapsed. He pushes forward until the crack widens into a small canyon, stars barely visible through the gap above. A sound freezes him. Not dogs, not voices. Footsteps on stone very close, maybe 20 meters ahead where the canyon curves. McCoy drops into the water. Delich and Spielman splash in beside him. They press against the canyon wall, submerged to their necks, motionless. The footsteps draw closer. 2 sets, maybe 3. A patrol. Light appears around the curve, a flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. McCoy holds his breath as the beam illuminates the water 10 meters upstream, then moves on. The footsteps reach the curve. 2 Japanese soldiers appear, rifles slung, moving casually on a routine patrol. They're 5 meters away. 4. The flashlight beam swings toward McCoy's position. He presses harder against the stone as the beam hits the water 2 meters to his left. It holds. The soldiers speak in Japanese, discussing something. McCoy doesn't move, doesn't breathe. The beam moves closer, 1 meter away, half a meter. It touches the water directly in front of him. The soldier with the light steps forward and leans over, his hand entering the water 30 centimeters from McCoy's face. McCoy sees the man's features clearly, young, maybe 20, hand searching in the water. He straightens, holding up a stick. He shows it to his companion. They laugh. The stick floats away. They turn and walk back the way they came. McCoy counts to 100, doesn't move, counts to 200. The footsteps fade. Silence returns. He rises slowly from the water, Delitzsch and Spielman beside him. No one speaks. Speaking isn't necessary. They all know how close that was. Seconds from discovery. A hand's breadth from capture. They move again, away from where the patrol went, deeper into the canyon, into darkness and unknown terrain, and the desperate hope that somewhere ahead, guerrillas wait. Deep in Luzon's jungle highlands, the guerrilla camp sits invisible from the air. In the command hut, Lieutenant Commander Melvyn McCoy squats over Colonel Giles Merrill's maps, marking Japanese positions around Subic Bay from memory. His hands shake, not from fear, but from the effort of holding the pencil. He weighs perhaps 115 pounds, his ribs pressing against his skin like internal prison bars, yet his mind remains sharp, cataloguing 3 years of captivity and the chaos of the sinking Oryoku Maru. Merrill leans forward as McCoy describes the tennis court at Olongapo, where survivors gathered after the American bombing. The guerrilla leader's face darkens at what followed. The men who made it ashore, who survived their own navy's attack, were crammed onto 2 more Hell ships, the Oryoku Maru and the Brazil Maru. Hundreds died in those holds from suffocation, starvation, and more American bombs that couldn't distinguish prisoners from enemy cargo. McCoy's voice is steady as he reports this. Inside, the knowledge burns. His gamble to swim for the jungle instead of the tennis court saved his life. Those who followed orders, who believed rescue would come, sailed into floating coffins. Survival had required the courage to disobey. The intelligence McCoy provides is invaluable. Troop strengths, guard rotations, camp locations, and the deteriorating morale of Japanese forces as American liberation pushes closer. But intelligence gathering isn't extraction. For 3 weeks, McCoy and the 9 other escapees wait in the highlands while coded messages pass between guerrilla radios and American submarines. The guerrillas feed them carefully, knowing too much food would kill men with stomachs shrunk to fists. They receive rice gruel twice daily and portions of boiled sweet potato, enough to stay alive but still hungry. McCoy forces himself to eat slowly, to rebuild the strength he'll need. They are not safe yet. Japanese patrols constantly sweep the mountains, hunting guerrillas and the Americans they shelter. Every few days, scouts report enemy columns in the valleys below, forcing the camp to relocate twice, melting into the jungle and reforming miles away. McCoy learns to move silently despite his weakness, to freeze at hand signals, and to trust the Filipinos who risk execution to protect him. Freedom remains theoretical. Safety is an illusion maintained by vigilance. The coded message arrives on February 22nd. USS Besugo. Rendezvous coordinates. Tomorrow night, moonless. McCoy reads the decrypt twice. After 3 years of captivity, the sinking, the swim, and the jungle, the final obstacle emerges. He must reach the coast, 15 miles through Japanese-controlled territory. He must descend from the highlands to a specific grid coordinate on the beach and arrive during a precise 2-hour window when the submarine will surface. If they miss that window, the Besugo will vanish into the deep with no second chances. The Japanese patrol the coast heavily, aware of submarine operations offshore, with guard posts, searchlights, and irregular beach patrols. One encounter means recapture or execution. McCoy studies Merrill's coastal maps until he has memorized every trail and danger point. 3 weeks of gruel has not restored what 3 years of starvation stole, but ready or not, he moves tomorrow night. February 23rd passes in tense preparation. Merrill assigns his best scouts to guide the 10 American escapees, accompanied by 6 Filipino guerrillas. They travel light, armed only with knives, noise discipline absolute. They leave at dusk, using the remaining light for the initial descent. McCoy's legs tremble on the first steep grade, gravity pulling him downward faster than his atrophied muscles can control. He grabs vines to steady himself, fighting to stay quiet. Behind him, the other escapees struggle similarly. Men who once commanded ships now barely manage a jungle trail. The scouts move like shadows ahead, pausing for the weakened Americans to catch up while listening for patrols. Darkness falls completely, the new moon providing no light. McCoy follows the man ahead by sound and touch until his boot catches a root and he falls hard, biting his tongue to stifle a cry. The scout ahead freezes, hand raised. Voices drift up from below, Japanese. A patrol is on the lower trail. The guerrillas fade into the jungle, pulling the Americans with them. McCoy presses himself flat behind a fallen log, his heart pounding. The Japanese voices grow louder as 4 or 5 men talk casually, their boots crunching on gravel 15 feet away. A flashlight beam sweeps the undergrowth but misses their prone bodies. The patrol passes. After 10 minutes, the scouts move again. McCoy rises on shaking legs. They have barely covered 5 miles. 10 remain. They reach the coastal lowlands near midnight. The terrain flattens, but the danger multiplies, with 200 yards of open ground between the jungle and the beach. There is no cover, and guard posts are visible as points of light along the shore. The scouts lead them parallel to the coast, staying just inside the tree line as they move toward the rendezvous point, stopping every 100 yards to listen. The Americans must cross the open sand and reach the water between the deliberately unpredictable intervals of beach patrols and sweeping searchlights. For an hour, the scouts study the patterns. McCoy lies at the jungle's edge, tracking the irregular sweeps of the lights and the erratic timing of the foot patrols. The margin for error is 0, the lead scout signals. Now. McCoy runs, but his legs barely respond. Each step is agony, his muscles screaming, depleted by starvation and hours of descent. The sand grabs at his boots. The other escapees spread out, stumbling towards the water. 100 yards. His vision darkens at the edges as his legs buckle. He forces them forward. Behind them, a searchlight begins its sweep, moving in their direction. They are not going to make it. 150 yards. McCoy's lungs burn. The light sweeps closer. 50 feet behind them, then 40. He can see his shadow stretching ahead from its beam. 30 feet. The water gleams. 20. He dives, hitting the surf just as the light passes over where he stood. Salt water closes over his head. The beam sweeps the empty beach behind him and moves on. McCoy surfaces, gasping. The other escapees thrash beside him in the shallows as the scouts guide them out, past the first sandbar, into water over their heads. McCoy's arms are lead, each stroke a conscious command. Kick, pull, breathe. His body wants to quit, but stopping means drowning. 100 yards offshore, the scouts whistle softly. They tread water, waiting. McCoy's legs cramp, but he forces them to keep kicking. Minutes pass. There is only black water and the distant surf. Did the submarine surface? Are they in the right place? His arms are failing. Then a shape materializes from the darkness, black against black. The conning tower of the USS Besugo breaks the surface 30 yards away, silent, deadly. Beautiful. Hands reach down from the submarine's deck, strong hands belonging to sailors who aren't starving. They grab McCoy's wrists and pull. He tries to help, but his arms have nothing left. They haul him up like dead weight and lower him through the hatch. His feet touch the deck and his legs give out. A sailor catches his collapse. Others descend behind him, pulled aboard one by one. A wool blanket is wrapped around McCoy's shoulders, its softness impossible. He begins to shake, not from cold, but from the release of tension, from the reality of his rescue. An American voice speaks close to his ear. "You're safe, sir. You're going home." McCoy tries to respond, but his throat closes. A sailor helps him down a ladder into the sub's interior. Warm, clean air fills his lungs. The smell of coffee, diesel, and American cigarettes. The hatch clangs shut, and the deck tilts as the Besugo begins its dive. McCoy sits on a bench, watching the other 9 escapees descend. All 10 men who swam from the Oryoku Maru, who chose the jungle, who crossed enemy territory, all aboard, all safe. The sub's executive officer appears with a clipboard and warm broth. An officer takes their name, rank, and service number, his eyes widening as McCoy mentions Bataan, Corregidor, Cabanatuan, Bilibid, and the Oryoku Maru. The doctor arrives, a young lieutenant trying to hide his shock at the skeletal figures. He weighs each man. McCoy is 114 pounds and documents symptoms of beriberi, scurvy, and tropical ulcers, declaring all 10 in need of careful nutritional rehabilitation. Broth arrives in tin cups, and McCoy drinks slowly. The crew gives up their bunks for the escapees. McCoy lies on a thin mattress, his first bed in 3 years. The submarine hums, diving deeper, putting distance between them and Luzon. Sleep won't come. Each time he drifts off, his mind jerks him awake, convinced he'll wake in Bilibid, but he opens his eyes to clean metal walls and the steady hum of diesel engines. Real, free, home. Before dawn, the intelligence officer arrives, a lieutenant commander like McCoy, but well-fed and clean-shaven. In the tiny wardroom, McCoy spends 2 hours describing everything: the Oryoku Maru's hold, the bombing, the swim, the tennis court, and the fate of the 1,500 prisoners who didn't make his choice. When McCoy mentions the 2 subsequent Hell ships and the hundreds more who died, the officer's pencil stops. "Jesus Christ," he says quietly, "we didn't know." McCoy nods. No blame, just fact. American planes bombed American prisoners because Japan transported them in unmarked vessels, making them legitimate targets. The tragedy was inevitable. McCoy then details Japanese defenses, troop strengths, and collapsing morale, providing map coordinates for every camp he can identify. "This information will save lives," the officer says. "When we liberate these camps, we'll know exactly where to go." It is something. His 3 years were not wasted. The USS Besugo surfaces after dark, making speed toward American-controlled waters. McCoy stands on the bridge beside the captain, breathing the night air. Behind them, Luzon fades into darkness. Ahead lies the open ocean and the long journey home. "You're the first Bataan survivors we've picked up," the captain says, glancing at McCoy's skeletal profile. "Most of the crew didn't think anyone could survive what you've been through." McCoy is quiet for a moment. He survived through luck and a desperate decision others could not make. The arbitrary mathematics of survival. Of 1,500 men on the Oryoku Maru, perhaps 400 survived the sinking, but only 10 escaped to the jungle. "I'm not the first," McCoy finally says. "Won't be the last. There are thousands still in camps. They're the ones who need to survive." The captain nods. "We're winning. We'll liberate them all soon." McCoy wants to believe it, but he knows timing is everything. In mid-March 1945, the submarine delivers them to American forces in Leyte. Reporters are waiting, and though the story makes headlines, McCoy gives only a brief statement before refusing further interviews. He is not interested in fame. He wants the Navy to understand what happened on the Hell ships and to liberate the camps. He is evacuated to a hospital for treatment, real beds, real food. His weight climbs slowly, but the nightmares start immediately. Every night he is back in the hold, drowning as bomber engines scream overhead. The doctors say it will fade. McCoy doubts it. Some things become part of your bones. Free, yes. But the scars, visible and not, would define everything that followed. The world assumed his war ended when Besugo's hatch closed and the submarine dived towards safety. McCoy knew better. Escape was one thing. Living with what he'd witnessed, with the choices he'd made, with the 1,000 men who didn't make it out, that was something else entirely. The hardest battle wasn't surviving captivity, it was learning to survive freedom. That fight had only just begun. Chapter 7. Lieutenant Commander Melvyn H. McCoy stepped off the submarine USS Nautilus in January 1944, gaunt and exhausted, but alive. His first words to the medical officer were not about his own condition, but about the men still aboard the transport ships. Within hours of reaching headquarters, still in borrowed clothes that hung loose on his frame, McCoy sat for his initial debriefing. The intelligence officers expected a standard escape report. What they received was the first comprehensive American eyewitness account of what would become known as the Hell ships, Japanese transport vessels moving Allied prisoners under conditions that violated every principle of the Geneva Convention. McCoy's testimony, combined with that of his 9 fellow escapees, filled 12 single-spaced pages that would remain classified for 23 years. The debriefing documented not just the Oryoku Maru, but the systematic brutality of Japan's prisoner transport system. His description of men dying of suffocation in sealed holds, of prisoners forced to drink their own urine, of bodies thrown overboard without ceremony, these details became evidence. In 1946, McCoy co-authored 10 Escape from Tojo with fellow escapee Colonel Steve Melnick and journalist Wellborn Kelly. The book sold modestly, received respectful reviews in military publications, and then disappeared from public consciousness, overshadowed by the larger narrative of victory, the occupation of Japan, and America's rapid pivot toward the Cold War. The Navy awarded him the Legion of Merit. The citation mentioned his meritorious conduct during captivity and his valuable intelligence contribution. It did not mention that his debriefing had influenced the prosecution strategy at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. It did not mention that his testimony about the Oryoku Maru helped establish the legal framework for trying Japanese officers for war crimes related to prisoner transport. McCoy returned to naval service. He commanded a destroyer, then took a desk assignment at the Pentagon. He rarely spoke about the camps or the ships. When he did, it was only with other survivors. The nightmares, his family later recalled, persisted for decades. By 1950, the story had begun its long fade into archival silence. The war crimes trials concluded. The classified debriefings remained locked in filing cabinets at Naval Intelligence. McCoy's book went out of print. The reasons for this forgetting were multiple. First, the intelligence value of the debriefings required their classification. The details McCoy and the others provided about Japanese prison camps, interrogation, and transport procedures were considered operationally sensitive after the war. The Navy classified the reports secret. They would not be declassified until 1967, and even then, few researchers knew they existed. Second, the American public in the immediate post-war years had limited appetite for stories about suffering. The dominant narrative was victory, homecoming, and building the future. Hell ship accounts, with their unbearable details of American servicemen dying in Japanese holds, did not fit the triumphant mood. Publishers wanted stories about winning, not dying. Third, McCoy's story was overshadowed by more famous POW narratives. The Bataan Death March became the defining image of Japanese atrocity against American prisoners. The specific horror of the hell ships, more than 20,000 Allied prisoners killed not by deliberate execution but by suffocation, dehydration, and friendly fire, remained buried in broader casualty figures. The Oryoku Maru was one of dozens of such ships. McCoy's escape was extraordinary, but the deaths were counted among the general toll. Fourth, McCoy himself chose silence. Like many POWs of his generation, he returned to a culture that lacked the language for trauma. He had a career to rebuild, a family to support, and memories he could not share with people who had not lived them. His daughter later recalled asking about the war once. He told her he had been captured and had escaped. When she pressed for details, he changed the subject. She learned not to ask. But the story was not entirely forgotten. It lived in 3 places. First, in the classified archives where McCoy's debriefing sat alongside thousands of other intelligence documents, waiting. Second, among the survivors, the men who had been in the camps, who had survived other hell ships, who had known men aboard the Oryoku Maru. They knew. At reunions of the American defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, McCoy's name was spoken with reverence. The story was told quietly among those who had earned the right to hear it. Third, in McCoy's own family. His wife kept a folder of documents, his Legion of Merit citation, a copy of the book, newspaper clippings from 1946, and letters from fellow survivors. She did not talk about them often, but she preserved them with care. The rediscovery began in 1978 with a researcher named Donald Knox. Knox, a historian specializing in the Pacific War, was compiling oral histories of American POWs in Japanese captivity. He was interviewing survivors when a veteran mentioned the Oryoku Maru and the 10 men who escaped. Knox had never heard the story. He began searching. The first breakthrough came at the National Archives. A reference librarian directed him to a set of declassified naval intelligence reports from 1944. Box 891 contained McCoy's debriefing. Knox was the first civilian researcher to read it since its declassification 11 years earlier. The detail was staggering. McCoy had not simply recounted his escape, he had documented the entire hellship system as he experienced it. He had provided deck plans of the Oryoku Maru drawn from memory. He had listed names of Japanese guards and their specific acts. He had estimated prisoner deaths by day and by cause. The debriefing was not just a survival story, it was a war crimes prosecution document. Knox tracked down McCoy's widow. He died in 1976, 2 years before Knox found the file. She gave Knox access to his personal papers, including annotated drafts of 10 escape from Tojo and correspondence with other survivors. She told Knox her husband had wanted the story preserved but hadn't known how to make people care. Knox's work resulted in Death March, The Survivors of Bataan, published in 1981. The book included extensive material on the hell ships and featured McCoy's account prominently. It brought the story back into limited circulation, primarily among military historians and veterans organizations. The second wave came in 1997, when Hamptonsides, researching what would become ghost soldiers, encountered the Oryoku Maru story while investigating the Cabanatuan prison camp raid. Sides tracked down surviving witnesses and obtained newly declassified documents through FOIA requests. His book, published in 2001, introduced McCoy's story to a mainstream audience. Ghost Soldiers became a bestseller. A generation of readers learned about the hell ships for the first time. The third preservation effort was institutional. In 2004, the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, created a permanent exhibit on the hell ships. The centerpiece was a scale model of the Oryoku Maru's hold, constructed from McCoy's debriefing diagrams. Museum curators acquired McCoy's Legion of Merit medal from his family and displayed it alongside excerpts from his testimony. Visitors could read his words describing the conditions aboard the ship. The museum's educational materials now list McCoy by name as a primary historical source. The modern military legacy of McCoy's testimony is specific and ongoing. At the Navy's Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape School in Brunswick, Maine, instructors teaching the Code of Conduct reference the Hell Ship accounts as foundational documents. Article 3, if I am captured, I will continue to resist by all means available, and Article 5, when questioned, I am required to give only name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Both drew on debriefings like McCoy's when the code was formalized in 1955. McCoy's documentation of Japanese interrogation, how senior officers maintained morale, and how prisoners gathered intelligence, these became baseline data for resistance training protocols. The lesson was encoded into doctrine. A captured service member is not out of the fight. Observation, documentation, survival, and escape all remain duties. McCoy's escape proved the principle. The Oryoku Maru case also became central to the Navy's legal education on the law of armed conflict. At the Naval Justice School in Newport, Rhode Island, instructors teaching the Geneva Conventions use McCoy's debriefing as a case study in prisoner transport violations. His testimony helped convict Japanese officers at the war crimes trials. Those convictions established legal precedents that inform the modern interpretation of Convention Thread Article 20, which governs prisoner transport conditions. When Navy JAG officers today assess detainee transport, McCoy's account is in the reference material. The Oryoku Maru is the example of what violates the law. In 2012, when the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency undertook a comprehensive review of Hell Ship casualties, McCoy's debriefing provided the baseline data for identifying remains. His list of names and death dates, cross-referenced with Japanese transport records declassified in the 1990s, allowed forensic anthropologists to connect recovered remains to specific individuals. As of 2019, the agency had positively identified 17 sailors who died aboard the Oryoku Maru, largely because McCoy had documented who was in which hold and when they died. Melvyn McCoy died in 1976 at age 64. He is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 30, grave 835-3. His headstone lists his rank and his decorations. It does not mention the Oryoku Maru. Every December, on the anniversary of the ship's sailing, members of the American defenders of Bataan and Corregidor lay a wreath at the Hell Ship's Memorial in Subic Bay, Philippines. McCoy's name is carved there, not among the dead, but among the witnesses, the men who survived to tell what happened. His testimony lives in 3 places now. First, in the National Archives, where researchers access his debriefing regularly. Second, in SERA school curricula, where his example teaches resistance. Third, in the prosecutorial record of the Tokyo trials, where his words helped establish that killing prisoners through deliberate neglect is murder under international law. His granddaughter, interviewed for a 2018 oral history project, said she grew up knowing her grandfather was a POW who had escaped. She did not learn the details until she was 43, when she read Ghost Soldiers. She visited the museum in Fredericksburg and saw his medal in the display case. Standing in front of the model of the Oryoku Maru's hold, reading his description of men suffocating in the darkness, she finally understood why he never talked about it. What she remembers now is what her mother told her. He kept a list. In his desk, in a locked drawer, he kept a handwritten list of every name he could remember from the ship. Not the men who escaped with him. Those names were in the book, in the official record. The other names, the ones who did not make it off the Oryoku Maru. The ones who died in the holds, or in the water, or on the beaches. He updated it occasionally when he met other survivors and learned names he had not known. When he died, the list had 247 names on it. His widow gave it to the military historians. They verified every name they could. Most were already in the casualty records. 16 were not. Because of McCoy's list, those 16 men were added to the official roster of Oryoku Maru dead. Their families, some of whom had spent 30 years with their loved ones listed as missing in action, finally received confirmation. That is the story beneath the story. Not just that McCoy escaped, though that was extraordinary. Not just that he testified, though that was crucial. But that until his death, he carried the weight of the names. The men who did not escape, the men whose testimony would never be heard. He made sure they were counted. That was his mission. It did not end when the submarine reached port. It ended when he did.